Hey everyone, welcome back to another recap podcast from SNXweave, where we give quick weekly recaps of news and important updates from the previous week from the Spartan Council and core contributors, as well as discuss what the Grants Council and ambassadors are up to, so let's get started. The noon key release has gone out. This release brought 8 additional perpetual futures markets: Sol, AVAX, Matic, Aave, Uni, Euro, Gold, and Silver. Next, SIPs 198 and 222, to update the atomic exchange function and the exchange fee system respectively, are both ready to go. Caleb is working on the parameterization and circuit breakers, and he said the goal is to add new stables when 198 is launched. The point of SIP 198 is to allow for low fees on stablecoins, possibly as low as 15 basis points. Both of these SIPs are currently on Kovan and should hopefully be launched on mainnet this week. As for the upgraded liquidation mechanism, it's currently back in audit for a second check. Kane actually had a call with the auditors about increasing capacity, and he said we should hopefully have a couple of additional resources allocated to us by June. Regarding futures automation, the council said the pausing bot was successfully tested on Kovan. They're still going back and forth with Chainlink on the performance for oil, however. Caleb said there's still some work to be done before increasing the caps, adding that although the pausing bot is currently live on mainnet, they need to keep it as a tracking item for now while they continue to review its performance. Arthur will be starting on the rate limiting aspect of futures soon. The purpose of this is to put a cap on how much and how quickly the futures markets can issue SUSD. It's a safety mechanism that was recommended by the auditors in order to cap any possible abuse in the event of an exploit or bug. The council also discussed SIP 229, proposing an optimism bridge for synths. Now that the debt pools have been merged, SUSD is fungible on L1 and L2. However, since there aren't any bridges currently set up, it's still not possible to send SUSD between layers. SIP 229 will therefore enable the transfer of SUSD for deposit and withdrawal through the optimism bridge. According to DB, this SIP is code complete. However, there will need to be some coordination with Chainlink to finalize before sending it for audit. Deprecation of L1 staking and debt migration also came up during the call. There was a question about why it has become such a low priority, and Kane explained that the debt migration SIP is likely only required for the top 150 wallets, because most of the other users should be able to get enough SUSD to migrate their positions. He added, if we wanted to get more users to L2, we have a pretty simple mechanism for this. We can shift the inflationary rewards towards L2 to incentivize that transition. Caleb also pointed out that there hasn't been a significant impact on the staking ratio from the inflation increase. Kane argued, however, that he expects it to take a few more weeks for users to catch up to the higher APYs. Caleb and Daniel reviewed some of the staking data and noticed that while the ratio is 97% on L2, it seems to be very stable on L1 at around 60%. Daniel agrees with letting it play out a little bit longer, but thinks there need to be better tools in place to monitor this. Daniel also called attention to the fact that inflation rewards would be at 2.2 million per week at the end of the next 4 weeks. And Caleb suggested tilting staking rewards to L2 as a way of bringing the staking ratio up. Kane brought up that even at 2.2 million in weekly rewards, the inflation as a percentage of total supply would still not be at the highest it's ever been. The previously recorded high was 1.4 million on a total supply of 100 million SNX. So proportionally, that would be about 3.2 million weekly rewards now. Kane said if we got to that point and we're still not seeing any movement, that's probably when I'd be open to making some changes. Lastly, Afif gave the council some V3 updates. Leo and Noah are working together on some of the V3 implementation items, and Afif said the team is finishing out engineering feasibility for account tokens. He explained that this is the concept of wrapping your whole staking position under the differentiated debt pool into a single position token. He added that once we work through some more of the feasibility and finalize SIPs, the next step will be to merge them so people can start digesting the contents. There's also been some discussion about another possible office hours event for V3 to take some more community questions, so stay tuned to hear more about this. There were also quite a few SIP presentations last week, so let's briefly review them. First, there was SIP 203 for the addition of a volume source fee. Presented by Kane, this SIP proposes adding an optional source fee as a transaction parameter that can be passed from any front end to the Synthetics exchange contracts. Kane explained that the existing volume program is capped, so it's insufficiently incentivizing to get other integrations over the line. Adding a source fee at the protocol level will allow integrators to capture fees from the volume they route through Synthetics. The initial SIP proposes a subtractive fee, however the SIP has been changed to make it additive to create competition on as many dimensions as possible. KSET asked if there will be a maximum fee that can be passed through, and Kane said there will need to be a cap, possibly at 100 basis points. Daniel asked if the volume partner has total control over the fees after setting it originally, and Kane confirmed they can change it at any time. The next presentation was SIP 224 for a KPI-based ambassador mandate. Millie presented this SIP, which will introduce a series of key performance indicators for the Ambassador Council. These KPIs include things such as delegated voting power, number of social events and their audience, grant referrals, SIPs written by the Council, and more. Caleb questioned what kind of reporting mechanism will be used regarding transparency. Millie said the plan is to compile data monthly, adding that there will be very little overhead in the tracking process. Kane and Daniel challenged whether a SIP was necessary for this kind of change. Matt emphasized, however, that if it were just a spoken mandate, future ambassador councils could choose not to adhere to it. It therefore makes more sense as a formalized SIP rather than a self-imposed measuring stick. The next presentation was SIP 227 for configuration of new synths, futures, and shorts via SCCP. Caleb presented this SIP, which proposes allowing the Spartan Council to vote on adding new synths, futures markets, and shorts via SCCP rather than a SIP. The idea behind this SIP is to decrease governance fatigue and expedite the listing of new assets that are straightforward and might not warrant the slow governance process of a SIP and presentation. Consensus was reached that only asset instruments with existing Chainlink feeds can be added via SCCP. The last SIPs to be presented were SIP 225 to add a curve futures market and SIP 226 to add an SNX futures market. Both of these SIPs were presented by Caleb, who explained that the plan is to add these products to the futures markets with low interest caps. The idea is to bring more volume to the futures functionality. Kane brought up that with SIP 227, adding SNX futures would allow spot SNX to be added later via SCCP, which he's strongly opposed to. Caleb will be adding language to the SIP that requires other SNX products to be added via SIP in the future. These will be placed on hold until there is more consensus and other synths have been rolled out. In Grants Council updates, the team has been discussing the 300 lieutenant position a little bit more in depth. They currently have one possible candidate, and Mike is in the process of outlining the responsibilities for the role. The council is also still working on getting some Synthetics tutorial YouTube videos put together. This will likely be broken into two sub-initiatives. One formal version with hired contractors, and one informal version with community submissions. The more formal half will be where the council works closely with Quenta on futures-related explainer videos. Mike will be leading the coordination on these formal videos, and the rest of the team will be drafting up a competition notice for the community videos. The hope is to have this out sometime this week. Regarding the hero stats page, the team had a very good meeting with a data engineer who provided some options for building a whole new data acquisition approach. The council plans to meet with the core contributors this week to get a final answer on whether they will be able to rely on them for their data needs or if they should seek external resources. In other news, the hackathon that the Grants Council sponsored has finished. DevSpace is a global, student-run hackathon and conference that aims to provide solutions to real-world problems. Synthetics was a registered sponsor of the event, and core contributor Noah was the keynote speaker who represented the protocol. He put together a really great set of slides about Synthetics and delivered a thoughtful presentation that you can view on YouTube. So be sure to check out our blog post for a link to that video. In Ambassador Council updates, the team is in the midst of planning several L222 calls on top of their Spartan City Hall planning. They're currently planning an exciting grants-themed L222 call for next week. This call will feature Grant's team members from Synthetics, Lyra, DYDX, and Aave. It's going to be a full house. And speaking of city halls, the ambassadors hosted one last week with Thales and Uma. We got to hear Millie speak with Daniel from Thales and John from Risk Labs, which works on Uma. Thales, as we all probably know, started as a binary options spin-off from Synthetics, and Uma is an optimistic Oracle service that provides data for smart contracts. Millie asked our guests how they would describe optimistic assumptions as they apply to crypto in layman's terms. They explained that optimistic assumptions are the process by which a user makes a claim with a dispute period. If nobody disputes, then the transaction goes through. If it is disputed, then it gets escalated. Daniel said the idea behind optimistic assumptions is to build a system based on good actors with a fallback position that allows for a resolution in the case of a bad actor. John added that crypto right now is kind of like having to go to court to verify every transaction. And with optimistic oracles, you don't have to write a technical verification system that captures everything perfectly. The final vote is escalated to token holders, who are incentivized to return the correct answer so they can get rewards and protect the value of their token. The objective is to get an economically secure data input for smart contracts, which reduces the attack surface. The proposers post a bond that they lose if their data is inaccurate, which disincentivizes bad proposals, and disputers post an equal bond to disincentivize bad disputes. Daniel mentioned how Thales is on the verge of releasing exotic markets that would use its own version of optimistic oracles. Millie asked him to elaborate a little more on this and explain how these fit together. He said they noticed from the community that there is a desire to have custom markets, so they came up with the idea for an Oracle Council. Their framework is customized such that the markets can be disputed when they're created, and bonds are required for creators and disputers. Regarding dispute resolutions, Daniel said the biggest driving motivation was to make sure markets are fair for participants. There is, however, still some human element for verification, so it's not fully trustless. He went on to say that to him, that's kind of what optimistic oracles are, a compromise. John added that some disputes are human-mediated and some are done by a bot. Disputers only receive half the bond tied to a bad proposal to ensure there is a penalty for a disputer disputing their own bad proposal. He said, "We want to make sure that the cost of corruption is always higher than the profit for corruption." Here's a quick overview of how each of these dispute processes work. For Thales, disputes are handled primarily through the Oracle Council. 3 of 5 votes are required to resolve a vote in either direction, with the Thales Council serving as a backstop. They can pause a contract at any time if there's an issue. Any user can establish a market, and users must capture the full range of outcomes in whatever market they are proposing. Users can then take their positions on that market, which must happen before the event happens. The odds are determined at the end of the positioning phase, at which point there is a maturity phase where anyone can set the result. This is where the disputes come in. There's a 24-hour period from the end of the event until the claiming phase begins, and if a dispute is filed and the Oracle Council resolves this dispute, that window drops down to 4 hours. Uma follows a slightly different process. Anyone can ask a question to the Oracle, and anyone can propose an answer. The default challenge window is 2 hours, but this is a configurable variable. If it is disputed, all the UMA voters go to the interface and propose their vote secretly. The voting period is 24 hours, and all the voters who voted correctly receive token rewards and get their gas costs rebated. At least 5% of token holders must vote or it gets put to a revote, but the average voter participation so far has been between 30 and 40%. Towards the end of the call, Clayton joined the stage. As a community lead at UMA, he's a big fan of optimistic oracles. He said he thinks they're going to be central in a lot of Web3 applications because they allow more flexibility in the questions that can be asked. Millie also asked our guests how they justify the decentralized peer-to-peer use case for end users over the centralized alternative. John said it's about incentive alignment, trust minimization, and availability, adding that the under-recognized aspect of decentralized services is that they can be built to be resilient and autonomous. Daniel said a huge part of why we're all involved in crypto and DeFi is market fairness and to get away from centralized institutions, adding that centralized systems are often set up so that the house always wins. If you'd like to hear the whole call, be sure to check out our blog post for a link to the recording. And that's it for today's updates. Be sure to check out our weekly recap blog post, share this podcast link, and let us know what you think and what you'd like to hear more about from SNXweave. Thanks for listening.